Episode 16, Sean Seale.
Welcome to the Oxidative Potential Podcast, where we discuss all things sports science and performance. I'm your host, Matthew DeRoche, and with me is my fellow co-host, Phil Batterson. Enjoy. Good day, folks. So on today's episode, we have Sean Seale from Upside Strength. Now, Sean is one of those guys that inherently makes me feel a little bit lazy. And it's not because I'm, not working hard or anything like that. It's just that the amount of content and engagement that this guy has is, 10 times anything I can ever imagine doing. I don't honestly understand how he does it. Running his own business with consultations, training, coaching, testing, and the content that he puts out there on YouTube, his podcast, social media. It's hard to wrap my head around trying to manage all these plates at once. But yeah, so, he's such an impressive guy. And, I really look up to a lot of the stuff that he's doing in terms of, some of his protocols and some of the stuff that he does. Like he's literally on the pulse. If there's anyone that's on the pulse of things, it's Sean. Like he's, always incorporating new things into his practice, which is very commendable, and trying to give them a fair chance and really understand their uses and applicability for sports performance testing and training and stuff. So, if I have questions, this is the guy that, I want to answer them, because he really does, he goes out there and walks the walk. So, in today's episode, we talk a lot about, CrossFit, endurance sport, training and testing for these things, accountability as a coach. We go into so much, surrounding sport performance, training for sport. And, it's super interesting hearing Sean's take on a lot of these things and how his thinking has evolved surrounding a lot of this stuff. So I hope you guys enjoy this episode. I really did, and I took a lot away from it. And can't wait to have Sean back on again. There's endless amount of topics to talk about with this guy. So if you want to find him, I'll leave links to his, website, his Instagram, all that stuff, his YouTube channel, his podcast in the show notes. And other than that, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode and have a good day. So Sean, this has been kind of long overdue. Initially, when we first started the podcast, we were like, this is the guy we want to talk to, because when me and Phil kind of see the stuff that you're putting out there, the stuff you're experimenting with, it's great, because I love everyone that I have on this podcast, and they're all experimenters in their own way, but they also have more of a specific line that they're trying to really, really deep dig down into, which, to be fair, it's a very time consuming task when you're trying to take something to the nth degree and find, the formula to show to everyone else. Right. But you've kind of taken this route, which I consider, like the hands-on, like the entrepreneurial route, and just said, I'm going to throw myself into the fire. I'm going to figure out everything I can about exercise physiology by actually going through the practice of exercise physiology, right? Testing people, doing your own work, doing your own research. So kind of explain to me how you got to that point, because I'm sure you didn't start from the point of, bioenergetics and Moxie and these things. So give me a background on that.
Yeah, I will in a second. Matt, I want to thank you for having me on. Just looking at the roster you've had so far, people like Pat, Andre, Phil Skiba, all those guys and many more are all huge inspirations for me. And I've learned a lot from these people. So it's really great to be able to come and talk with you today after you've had those people on. And I look forward to the other guests that you'll have on down the road as well. Yeah. So I started my coaching journey about 8-9 years ago now in Vancouver, Canada. So I'm originally from Switzerland, moved to Canada after I was done my military service, and I was kind of done with being here. I just couldn't see the country anymore. That turned around later on, but I'll get to it. So went to Canada, I met my wife through a rugby party called Ladies Night at Burnaby Lake Rugby Club in Vancouver. So that kind of, I was thinking of just exploring the country, but 2 weeks in, I just met her, so that changed my plans a little bit. But anyway, moved there, and then started coaching. I was painting houses actually for a while, doing some labor jobs, and I was also I had done some CrossFit before that, and then found weightlifting through CrossFit. Competed in weightlifting for a couple years. I remember reading Zatsiorsky and Kramer's Science and Practice of Strength Training on the bus on my way to work. And one day my wife said, people need to start paying you for that. I said, okay. So I quit my painting job and I passed a certified personal trainer with the NSCA and started coaching. That was kind of the starting point. And then it went from, personal training, small group training, worked for a couple of gyms in Vancouver. And then we moved back to Switzerland 3.5 years ago now. I'm actually in the bedroom where I grew up. We took over my parents' apartment. And then about 2.5 years ago, I would say, and it was thanks to Evan Picon, that I started diving into, I guess, updating my understanding of bioenergetics, and through the lens of the Moxie. That was kind of the first intro that I had, or that was my door into exercise physiology. I was always interested in why before that, but I'd never really taken the steps to dig into it. And I think Evan's content was pivotal for me in the sense that it really opened that door, put light on the fact that what I thought I knew was not necessarily true. So the methods, and that's something that I had to go through. But when you question your understanding of something, it doesn't mean that everything you're doing is wrong. You could be doing the right things, just your justification for why you're doing them, that might not be exactly what you thought it would, right? So that's kind of the process I went through, put everything I thought I knew about conditioning, back on the table, trying to figure it all out. And then from there, I kind of never stopped trying to understand this whole realm of exercise physiology. And so started with one Moxie, and then I had 2, and then I had 3, and then I started to add other tools. I looked at HRV. I've got a VO2 master now. I've got lactate as well that I added recently, looking at adding some more metrics down the road. But essentially what I'm doing now is I split my time between a few different activities. I still do private coaching. I do some consulting with coaches, with athletes. I started this year giving seminars, and I've been solicited by a few organizations, either sporting or national, here in Switzerland and in France, to talk about different topics. So I'm really enjoying that process. And then on the testing side, on the XFIS side, I've been now for 1.5 years, I would say, really trying to understand testing athletes on the conditioning side, and trying to understand how to assess and then how to apply specific interventions depending on different athlete profiles, different sports. So right now I'm working with a lot of CrossFitters. I'm working with a lot of endurance athletes as well. And mainly until now, it was the testing process that I was focusing on. So essentially just figuring out what their physiological profile is at an instant in time, and then looking at what they need to be good at relative to their competition, to their sport, and then trying to bridge the gap between, okay, where are you now? Where do we need to get you to? And so I'm just still in that process of trying to figure out, okay, what's the best way to test? What's the best way to assess different qualities? And then what can we extract from a test? And how can we translate that into an actual training program that is going to address either the weaknesses or the needs of a given athlete? And so it's been an extremely enriching process for me, having the opportunity to work with many different athletes in many different sports. I've worked with a few fighters now, and I have a couple big testing days in a couple months with some pro boxers and MMA fighters as well. And then, like I said, endurance athletes, triathletes, CrossFit athletes, It's really, really interesting to see the whole spectrum, and then trying to extract all the principles and what we can extract from those different people, and then trying to optimize the way that we work with them.
That's that was a great overview. It's funny, we were probably in BC around the same time. I was living there for 2 years as well, back in 2017 to 19, probably. Were you there?
Yeah, so that was just before we came back. Yeah, where were you?
Out in Lake Country, like up in between Verna and Kelowna. Then we were in Salmon Arm for a bit too. But I spent a lot of time in Vancouver, living out of my van, because I was doing a lot of climbing, so I'd always be through Vancouver, because I was going through all that stuff. But yeah, that's wasn't because I was poor, folks. It was out of choice. Just to clarify that. But Evan does do and I think Evan does a great service for, exercise physiology in general, by drawing awareness to, everyday athletes, everyday coaches that may not be on the so much bioenergetics, ex-phys side, and really putting the model out there, being like, hey, everyone has specific needs, and their needs can be measured in several different ways. And if you measure these needs and kind of approach these needs, we'll probably get to where we're going quicker. And I don't think I've found anyone that does a better job of, well, I mean, you're up there for sure, but relaying, all that deep physiology onto people that, that are just trying to figure their way out and figure out, like, how do I get better? Right. He's great for that. But yeah, it's cool that you're kind of delving into what I consider like the last frontiers in exercise physiology in certain senses for sport, like MMA and CrossFit. I consider those two some of the last frontiers of trying to crack the code. Because when I used to fight back in the day, and whenever I first tried to find any literature surrounding fighting or energy systems and fighting and how to train a fighter, a lot of the research, like a bit 2015, 16, I got from CrossFit, actually, because they just started doing CrossFit research. But, all the other stuff was running, cycling. I was trying to like extrapolate, right, and make sense of it all. But that is, it's very studious of you, because a lot of people don't have the confidence to go out there and try and figure out profiles, figure out protocols that are suitable for these things, make sense of it, and say, hey, this is what we saw, and we actually seen these markers go up from our intervention or whatever it is. So kudos to you on that, because I think if more people try to attack those problems rather than being like, oh, there's not enough research on us to, you know what I mean? Like that kind of side of things. There is, you just have to extrapolate, right? Has that been your?
Yeah. And you have to extrapolate. You have to look at what's available and what's applicable and transferable, what's not. And you also have to do your N of 1 or N of 10 or N of 20, and then see for yourself, okay, what do we see? What emerges? What different profiles do we see? What common traits do we see amongst different athletes of different types of profiles? Somebody who's more powerful, somebody who's more endurance, somebody who lacks general physical preparedness. I mean, all those things tend to pop up. So like you said, I think really not getting too stuck into one discipline and necessarily the demands of the sport. What I found is that a lot of athletes in general, and I'm not yet working with very high level athletes, so I can't speak to that population, but amateur to advanced athletes, let's say, I've had a fair share of them so far. And what I see come through all the testing that I'm doing is a real lack of the basics in general. There is so much on the table in terms of basic, simple adaptations that they could get through some very simple training means that are just not done or not done properly. Maybe because people think that they need to be hyper specific to their sport all the time. Maybe because, MMA and CrossFit are still trying to figure out, okay, how do we fit in all those different skills that we have to learn, all those different modalities. And so I could see those sports, and then speaking very generally and not pointing fingers to anybody. And it's a very non-judgmental comment that I'm making here, by the way. Those coaches and athletes being kind of in the sport, they're like at the wheel, they're in the thing, and they maybe lack the distance or perspective of coming out of it and saying, okay, from a general standpoint, what are we maybe missing in the big picture here that we could address really, really easily, that could make a significant difference with very little effort and with very simple means, I would say.
Yeah, that's a very good point, because realistically, our contribution, with performance consulting and things like that, is as good as our integration with the relationships of the coach and the athlete. If they don't have buy-in, like I talk about buy-in a lot with this stuff, like especially with technology, and people are like, oh, it's kind of shady, but it's not really, because it's an objective marker that we're giving to the athlete and saying, hey, this is what it's saying. Like, I'm not telling you you need this, this is what it's saying. And it kind of helps the coach to see some objective data and seeing like, hey, okay, maybe he is, not just, towing on this zone 2 line and trying to shove all this, whatever it is, rest days or HRV, all this stuff down my throat. It's, he's showing me some hard data kind of back that up. And I think that's realistically, like I was talking to Derek Hansen the other day, and I think that's something that he's been really good at and enlightening the field, is like, working for all these elite sporting teams. He literally, just sits down and says, this is your barrier to entry, is making the relationships work. Because without that, it's, you can have the best data, you can have the best interventions in the world, and it's not going to be applicable. So that's interesting that you kind of spoke on that as well, I think, because like you said, especially when it's easy adaptations to gain, people tend to want to run the other way because they believe it's too good to be true, right? I don't know if you've seen that.
And I know we'll talk probably about, base endurance, zone 2, whatever you want to call it later on, but it's like CrossFitters telling me that their butt hurts when they sit for an hour on a bike. It's like, really, you did triple Fran yesterday just for fun, and now you're telling me that your ass hurts because you're sitting on a bike for an hour. It's funny. It's pretty funny when we go into that world and see how people relate to different types of efforts and intention. I wanted to come back on the technology you mentioned before and the testing and the data. I think you made a good point. I also think that, and what I found recently, is to maybe build the best relationships with the coaches that I'll be working with that are already, because oftentimes the athletes that I work with already have coaches or they're already working with someone. And so I'm the, like you said, a consultant. I come from the outside and I give them I guess an outsider's perspective on what I can see. And I try to be as objective as I can through whatever biases that I already have. But I think being very clear, both for myself and for the athletes, but more for the coaches that I work with, being extremely clear on the limitations of every method and every tool that I use. That's probably one of the most important things, because once the people that you work with see that you understand not only the strength, but the limitations that you're working with, you're able to actually give an honest picture of what's going on and not be biased towards one tool or another, or one method or another. I have no dog in the fight, right? I'm not publishing research. I didn't come up under someone that taught me a certain way, and so I owe them to stay that way. And I'm kind of simplifying here for argument's sake, but I try to really not have a dog in the fight, and just trying to be as objective as I can. That's probably something that I admired. It is something that I admired greatly in Pat Davidson when I first got to know him many, many years ago. I actually was able to organize a seminar in a CrossFit gym in Port Coquitlam back in the day. And that's something that struck me. It's like, here's a guy who's just telling you how it is, but he's got nothing to sell, right? He's not trying to push you one way or another, because that's not the point. He's just trying to get to the truth, whatever that may be, right? As elusive as that may be. But so I think I'm trying to stay in that spirit of, okay, let's figure out what is true, or what is the most true given our current methods of measurements and our not current understanding of what's going on under the hood, but not be blind to the fact that all those different methods have limitations and that none of them is perfect. and that we need to be very conscious of that if we want to do the best job that we can with the athletes that we work with.
Yeah, and it is a very good point, because, you know, in this type of profession, you don't it's good for athletes and coaches to understand we wouldn't be suggesting things that seem borderline insane from the other side of their perspective if we knew that they were going to essentially end up with worse performance for the athlete and the coach. Like, we wouldn't be in business very long, right? So sometimes helping them understand, like, hey, I'm here for your performance. I do this so you can get better, not so you can get worse. And I wouldn't be suggesting something that I think would put you in a worse position, right?
And it's a double-edged sword too, like you said, because now you're testing and hopefully retesting down the line. And you're collecting all the data. And if the data is not showing improvement on what you said was going to improve, then you have to question, okay, did I do the right thing? Was that the right prescription for the athlete at that point in time? Was I completely off the mark on what had to be done? So you just have to go in and try to do your best. And there's going to be some learning opportunities, we can call them, where things don't go the way that you thought they would. And it's an opportunity to maybe reconsider what you thought was actually appropriate in that situation, and go to the next step and say, okay, how can I do better next time? But you have to go in knowing that you don't know everything, and that it's not always going to pan out the way that you thought it would. I guess that's par for the course.
Yeah, accountability. That's one thing I love about this type of work, is you have the highest amount of accountability placed on you, right? And I like that. And some people, there can always be some friction there sometimes when people don't want to see that accountability. I was talking about this with John Kiley the other day, when we're talking about some coaches, like the friction between coaches, because sometimes when they see these hard metrics being pulled out, sometimes that can strike a little bit of fear into them and saying, oh, what if we weren't, you know what I mean? Because they think that is going to fall back on them sometimes. So it definitely, it's a very sharp line that, the whole accountability thing falls on, because, it makes everyone more accountable in general. But I think in the long run and for the good of the athlete, it's always, the best way to be towing the line. Let's get into some stuff about, critical power. We'll get back into some testing at the end before we get into final questions, because I'm interested on a few things to hear your take on. Now, this is something that's, I'm happy to see you get a little bit more traction lately. Critical Power with Phil Skiba's book, and, Breaking 2 coming out, and also some of the literature that's, being published as we speak, and connections to muscle fiber and capillarization and different things like that, W prime, durability, all these things. Where does critical power fall in line in your practice, even with yourself? How do you view this whole critical power model? How is it useful to you? Maybe it's not useful. Maybe you can elaborate on your thoughts on it.
I think it's a very interesting model because it brings together output, like performance, and physiology. It's kind of at the boundary of those two. And it's rare to find models that kind of overlay on both of those worlds, like both the output and then what's going on under the hood. So I find this fascinating about the critical power model. Now, and I'm stealing that directly from Pat Davidson's Rethinking the Big Pattern seminar, but he's got a picture of George Box, and all models are wrong, but some are useful. And I think this is very, very important to understand that it's not perfect, that it has limitations. Again, going back to knowing the limitations of what you use, it's very important to be conscientious and conscious of those limitations. So it's for me, it's a model that's interesting because it is one fairly simple way of having a good overview of an athlete's profile without needing any physiological data collected on them. So that is actually, I use the 3 and 12 minute tests that are referenced in a paper by Mehdi Kordi, if I'm not mistaken, where he compare if familiarization with those efforts, 3 minute and 12 minute are good. So you do them 2 or 3 times, you can get a reliable calculation of critical power and W prime for an athlete, or critical speed and D prime for a runner. Again, given the athlete knows how to pace themselves well on their effort, and they're actually at the limit of their potential on that given day and on that given time domain or distance for the running. And so, for example, I use those two tests before somebody comes to see me to do a full physiological profile. I get them to do a 3 and a 12 minute on whatever modality we're going to use, because now ahead of time, I know how to calibrate my test. I know how to calibrate my step test properly. And those are also simple tests that they can redo down the line to see if things are moving in the right direction, right? If we're doing a block of sprint interval training, well, we're probably going to want to see W prime going up. Yeah. So if we retest, and there's no movement on that, then maybe we missed something. Maybe that wasn't the right prescription, or else. So that's one interesting way that I see this, or that I use it, is actually to just help me with my work with the testing, simply because for me, the calibration of the test is probably the most important part. As in, if you calibrate your test properly, you're going to have all the data you need on that athlete, on the whole spectrum of intensity, from very easy to the hardest they can hold given the constraints of the protocol, and you're going to get again some good data that you can then work with. If you calibrate it wrong, if you start too high, if you make too big of a jump between steps, and you only I aim to collect always between 9 and 11 or 12 steps at the most. If you calibrate it wrong and you get out with 5 or 6 steps, well, now you have a huge gap between each step, and you're not going to be as precise, and the data is not going to be as interesting, I think, as if you can get a few more steps. So again, calibration for my tests, that's also something, critical power, that I've been trying to introduce to the CrossFit community here in the French speaking world through my seminar that I'm giving right now, essentially trying to highlight the importance of oxygen in performance. And so essentially just taking oxygen and looking at the whole spectrum of bioenergetics and how oxygen interacts at every single level with different functions in the body at a metabolic level, and then looking at oxygen and critical power as well, because I think there's a very interesting parallel there. So kind of going from physiology into practical application, and this model of critical power, which is fairly easy to apply if you understand its constraints, and then gives you a starting point of conversation of, okay, two athletes might have, the same critical power, but could have a very different W prime. Well, that's going to impact how many intervals they can do at 120% of their critical power. So you can't say, well, athlete 1 did 5 intervals and athlete 2 did 10, so athlete 1 is bad. No, that's not how it works. What if athlete 1 has a W prime that's half the size of the other guy? Well, again, we need to consider those things. So that's a first part of the conversation. And then right now I'm using, because the first threshold is always the hardest one, because at this point in time, I haven't found a way to get to it without physiological data. So the best that I've been able to do is take the critical power calculation and then essentially have a 3-tiered system, a 3-tiered system where if the person in question does no low intensity training during their week, I put them at 7% of critical power for their first threshold. If they're doing 1 hour or so, or maybe 2, I'll put them at 65. And if they're doing 4 hours or plus, I'll put them at 72%. And so from that, you have critical power, you have an estimation, a calculation of threshold 1, which is, again, it's a calculation. So it's the second best an actual physiological measurement. But for someone who doesn't have access to all this, someone who maybe doesn't have the time, the resources, for a coach who just wants to say, okay, I want to have some sound reasoning around programming, conditioning for my athlete on a given modality. Well, if you can already give them some basic training zones that are going to be ballpark fairly accurate for that athlete, and that they can work with, and that they understand why those are important, and they have to be individualized and they have to be specific to the modality, I think that's a huge step forward compared to maybe what the alternative is without such a model. So calibrating my tests and then bring something to the field that is easy to put in place for coaches and athletes that want to individualize training but maybe don't have the means to go farther into physiological profiling.
That's a really good. I've never heard anyone talk about the, actually using that 75 to 55% of critical power. I've seen research on it. I think it was like there was a group. I think it was under 20 cyclists, and they were well trained. And 75% was the mean, I think, for those well trained. From what I remember, I was in a lecture. I have the paper somewhere, but that is, and you're right, because I see a lot of math method or 220 minus your age kind of calculations. And when I think of the variance in, just thinking about 30-year-olds that I've tested and the variance in their heart rates, I've seen anywhere from 210 to 160 being max heart rates. So if you're using any type of, heart rate calculation off the bat, whether it's 220 minus your age zoning or math method, you're already way off the boat. There's nowhere close. But if you're doing something like critical power and then taking 7, you're getting a fairly good threshold line. And whenever you're kind of calculating off that threshold line, it's much more precise than, some ethereal heart rate that's, supposed to be, you know what I mean? It's way better.
I definitely think it's a step forward in the right direction, because the biggest issue I have with obviously somebody using heart rate zones versus using nothing is better. Mm-hmm. Okay, something is better than nothing, but it's still not good enough. What I dislike the most about those heart rate zones on fixed percentages is that it doesn't actually give you any leeway to evolve physiologically, right? Because this is what your zone 2 is, and this is what your zone 2 is going to be until you die. And maybe it's going to move down a couple beats because your heart rate max is going to go down with age. But really, there's no leeway for change. I tested this this woman, this CrossFitter, a couple months ago on the rower, and we did a test, retest. We did the whole gamut. She did the program to the letter for 2 months, and her heart rate went down between 15 and 20 beats at every step of the test. At every intensity, it went down 15 to 20 beats. So already in 2 months, this is a huge change. And obviously, she didn't have a structured program before, so the first adaptations are always going to be pretty big, and it's not going to be like this on the second block and on the third block. We don't have to kid ourselves with this. Diminishing returns over time, obviously, but I mean, we have to account for those changes, and if we don't, I think it's a huge disservice to frankly, the athletes, because they have to understand that they can change. That's the whole point of training. You have to, the goal is to change your physiology, right? So why are we fixed on heart rate metrics that are immutable and that will not change over time if the sole purpose of training is physiological adaptations and change? This is what we're trying to drive. And we have to have a model that reflects that if we want to be, again, as close to the truth as we can.
Yeah. And another thing that brought up to my head when you were talking about that is the one thing that is super nice about this is it's modality specific, right? Because my, math method for cycling versus, ski or running, two completely different worlds, right? Almost 20 beats and variation from some of the thresholds there for myself anyways. And especially for when you're talking about CrossFit athletes that have, low relative familiarization with some of these modalities, right? Like they don't have the luxury of spending, 15 hours a week on a skier, right? Not very many people do other than professional skiers. So it's, when you have these low time spent on these modalities and you can find something that's relatively specific rather than just transferring over these numbers. Also, you're getting testing data, like you say, it's truly a genius method. And something that we were talking about on the forums, VLA max, realistically, I think critical power or power duration modeling of other sorts really does steal everything you need out of VLA max. I think VLA max has some applicability when you're testing it with lactate to get a broad idea. But realistically, why are we testing the VLA max? We're trying to get an understanding of the profile of the athlete. Why not do that with a test that's going to give you performance, a snapshot in time, and also you know what I mean, threshold. So it's like, to me, it just makes the most sense. I don't even know why, you know. Anyways.
To bounce back on that, I had a really interesting email exchange with a guy called Andreas. I was exchanging with him on Twitter, and he followed up via email. And I just shared some of my own testing data on myself, some lactate numbers that I had collected on a step test, and then on different different types of training sessions. And I was really impressed, because he actually came back to me via email, and essentially, and it wasn't VLA max per se, and I'm not a fan of the metric as such, the VLA max itself, but he used my lactate numbers to establish my profile, and the whole idea of lactate production and lactate clearance. And obviously what you measure in the blood is it's just the difference between those two. So it's whatever you've produced minus what you've recycled. And given that I had given him all my numbers, he'd essentially established my profile, and he told me, okay, now I want you to go ride such and such interval. I think it was 4 times 2 minute on, 1 minute off at a given power output. And I did it, and I told him where I had to stop. And then he showed me the model that he had created, and to the minute he was like on point as to what I could do based on the lactate numbers that I had given him. So it was kind of the W prime idea, the whole like work capacity over critical power or over threshold. And he modeled that using lactate, and he was able to predict accurately what my performance would be on a given intensity with a given work to rest ratio. So that I find really interesting, because it's again blending of different perspectives, right? Some people are all about critical power, some people are all about lactate. Well, it turns out you're measuring different things, but at the end of the day, if your model is correct, you're going to arrive at the same conclusion. And so I don't. That's what I don't like to pick camps. I like to see what every camp has to say, and I want to see where it intersects in the middle, because I feel like if all those different methods join or meet somewhere, well, that somewhere is actually where you want to be. It's actually where it's going to be the most true, right? I forget what the technical term for it is, but essentially getting to the same conclusion from very different starting points. And that always reinforces the hypothesis quite a bit. So yeah, it's been interesting kind of digging into the exercise physiology realm. And I have the chance, I'm lucky enough to have a podcast as well, and to be able to interview all the different protagonists of the different approaches. I've had Mark Burnley on to talk about critical power. I've had Inigo San Milan to talk about lactate. I've had Phil Skiba to talk about his point of view, and many more. And again, getting all those different perspectives and see where they meet and what we can actually do with this down the line.
No, you're right, because there is, regardless whether it's polarized versus pyramidal, or, you know, lactate, VLA max versus, you know, different power duration modeling, everyone does have these meeting points. And I think it's good to kind of try and contest, you know, we should be critical of things, but we should also focus more on like, how do we get to where we want to go quicker, or more efficiently, or however, right? How do we design the protocols in the best way? And like you just said there, like VLA max, lactate is a very, very, I was talking about this with Andre, right? Because Andre came from, you know, lactate pretty much falls to the wall. And then, lactate's useless. He went the same route. I kind of was like, but I mean, not to his, I'm nowhere near the experience that Andre has with lactate. But, and then being like, oh yeah, this thing is actually quite useful again. But it takes a long time to wrap your head around the limitations of lactate. And also, I think lactate is to use lactate, to use it well, you have to be a very experienced practitioner with that tool, versus some of these other things. There's so many things that go into lactate, you know, pre-feeding, time during the week when you're testing, all these different things make such a big variance on it. And there's nothing wrong with that, because it's just the sensitivity of whatever you're measuring. But Yeah, and also understanding, like we brought up on the forums about, there's this divergence when we get to these homogenous groups of higher powered athletes that the VLA max actually lowers. And we're talking, kind of considering why. And this is stuff that I found from Mater back in, I don't know when, with rowers, like way back in the day. And I think the more you educate yourself on these things, it's just getting really good with whatever your model is, because most of the models out there work fairly well. Some of them are more expensive than the others. Some of them have more, they're more data rich. But like what I see with you doing, I see you building this like this almost, I don't want to call it like Frankenstein in an insulting way, but it's amazing because you are literally honing down this protocol, which I dream of someday, maybe getting a protocol to capture so much with the VO2 master. Like I would kill to just have your data in a sense, because it's like you've done so many of these protocols, even though like it's not like, for example, if you have VO2 max, yeah, of course, a 3-minute step, is debatable versus a 1-minute step, but you had, 50, tests to figure out what are exactly the variances on that. So you're combining everything in once and finding like, oh, well, if I'm doing lactate, maybe I want shorter rests or shorter breaks, maybe 15 seconds, 30 seconds, or just to get the finger while they're moving. All these things that you're figuring out while doing this. I really think you're going to find something amazing there, because, your moxie, lactate, respiration, spirometry. It just seems to me like the model that you're trying to kind of condense is going to be very, very data rich. I don't know how that's gone for you so far, but
it's been interesting because, like you said, there's a lot of data, so you have to know what to do with it, and that's been the not the hardest part, but a very, very interesting part for me is actually diving into all those specialties, all those different sporting disciplines, and figure out, okay, what in cycling, what is common ground? What do you find among cyclists, depending on age groups, depending on levels? What can you expect? Different populations, trained, untrained. Elias Leitonen, I believe his last name is, I hope I didn't botch that, has been really, really helpful as well. He's very active on Twitter and always answering questions. That, by the way, the exercise physiology, anybody who wants to learn about exercise physiology, you go on Twitter, you find the right people, you ask the right questions, and you will, I learn more. If I sit down and I tweet a few questions, I'll learn more that day than like the previous 3 weeks reading papers and watching, listening to podcasts and reading books, because you have all those experts that are more than happy to share their knowledge. And that's another thing I wanted to get back to is, maybe that's one of the lenses that I try to operate through, is be very open with what I do, because it helps me actually get better, right? If I get outside perspective, I get criticism, then I can actually improve. If I don't get any feedback, then all I know is what I know. So that's been kind of a driver as well, of trying to be open about, okay, here's my method, or here's my approach, and here's the compromise that I made between such protocol and such protocol for those reasons, being conscious that it has limitations for those reasons, but then trying to explain and be very clear on what I'm doing and what I'm getting out of it, and then what I'm not getting out of it, or what I shouldn't try to extrapolate from the data. But yeah, collecting the data, and then figuring out brackets of like, okay, is this good? Is this bad? Should it be better? Should it be worse? Starting to again, like you said, have quite a bit of data on hand, and starting to take the time to go back. And I don't have any formal I don't have any academic training. I don't have any formal training in statistics and running numbers, but again, listening to people that do, and trying to get better with my spreadsheet skills, and even simple things like, okay, I have my steps. Somebody ends on step number 10 and say it was 300 watts. Well, where does their first threshold, lactate threshold, sit relative to those max watts and percentage wise? And can I now pull that out for all the athletes that I tested and establish a kind of ideal profile of, okay, for this sport, I probably want that kind of percentage for threshold 1 versus that kind of threshold percentage for threshold 2. Do the same with VO2 percentages, because that's usually how it's done. But just trying to figure out, okay, what can I actually extract from the data? What is useful? And that was probably the hardest part, is then translate that into training recommendations. Because what I did from the start with the testing is I don't just do the test and give you the physiological data and say, good luck with that. I try to say, okay, from what I see and from what I think I know, this is probably the next steps that you should take in order to advance in your training for those reasons. So it started with very broad recommendations of this is the kind of work you should do. And now I'm actually giving, with every test, about 8 weeks of training to go on the back end of the testing, so that people can actually go and do the training and then do their retest and then figure out, okay, did it work? Did I get better? Was this the right thing to do? And getting the feedback from those athletes on, okay, this intervention worked really well for this profile in that situation. So now that validates this angle. Maybe for another one, it didn't. Right. And so I have to rework how I'm going to intervene for the next person that I see that has this given profile. But having all the data is cool, but then figuring out what you actually need to do with it is probably the most challenging part.
No, I hear you. And people can be turned off by some of this stuff because it's, overwhelmingly data rich, right? But as you get more experience and as you get more time, the data starts to kind of take its place, and you start to become more comfortable with, trying to find the trends, because it's not so overwhelming trying to understand, this kind of, slope versus that slope versus VT1 being here. And the thing about it is, even if you're diligent and you don't understand necessarily what you're collecting, as long as you're diligent and doing a decent protocol, being consistent with a protocol, and that will change over time as you start to understand protocols better. But if you be diligent and record the data well, you will serve yourself very good in the future when you come back and be like, oh, dude, I have, another 4 years of data. And because some people will be like, oh, I don't want to start, experimenting until I have this much knowledge or this much. And you lose out on a lot of data, right? Whether that's with yourself or with people that you work with. I always encourage people, just get more data, even if it's just heart rate, even if it's, a lactate meter, whatever it is. And I think, the data that you collect will be, I think you're going to have one of the most data rich, piles to kind of work back on in the future, because I think, especially, with the sports that you're working with, some of these sports that are kind of on the frontiers, like I was saying, I think, that stuff that'll be quite useful in the future.
Hopefully.
hopefully. So let's talk about, zone 2 training, because this is kind of hit the mainstream now due to some figures kind of in exercise physiology, like Maffetone, people like Peter Attia in the health and longevity community. They've really done a good job. Not just those guys, but, everyone's been kind of screaming this for years. It's just, how much reach do they have to the everyday person? What are some of the things you see maybe with zone 2 training? Do you see some misapplications in some places? Do you see maybe some really, really good applications in some sectors of sports and maybe less in others? What is your take on it? Just kind of give me an overview of where it sits with you, what you see.
Yeah. So it's kind of just been growing in importance in my mind and in my framework as I got to learn more and more about human physiology and how it works and what transfers and what doesn't. And so the misapplications that I see is obviously too high of an intensity. And that is, I have one athlete that I've tested so far that was actually doing their zone 2 training at the right intensity before they came to see me. Right. So everybody's training too hard. And going back to Charlie Francis quote that I love, keep your highs high and your lows low.
Yeah.
Right. You have to really respect that. And so that's, I guess, the biggest thing that I see is just everybody, even if you think you're training low enough, you're probably not. You're probably not training at a low enough intensity or running at a low enough speed. It's especially hard with running and working with CrossFit populations because they're usually pretty heavy just from their build. Nothing wrong with that, but that is going to be very impactful on their running. And so most CrossFitters should probably just put a weighted vest on and go hike in the mountain for 2 or 3 hours, and that should be their zone 2. Because if I tell them to run at 8 minutes per kilometer, they're just going to tell me to fuck off and never come see me again. Even though that's really what most of them probably need, right? And I had a and what gave me maybe confidence in that, or more confidence in that, is an interview I had recently with Jameson Plus, who is the U24 Ironman World Championship champion. He won the St. George in the U24 category like a couple months ago. And he told me that before he started working with Luke Way, his coach, he was running, 430 kilometers and being proud of his zone 2 work and all that stuff. And Luke tested him and said, "Hey boy, start running at 7 minutes per kilometer and then we'll see where you get to." And over 3 years, he's built that back up to running, 440 and actually being in zone 2. But it's taken 3 years of diligent, low intensity, calibrated work. So I think that's probably the biggest thing is everybody trains zone 2 too high. And usually it's because they don't have the metrics to actually, again, you have to have some physiological metric, whether it's ventilation or lactate or muscle oximetry, if you want to be precise in your zone 2 prescription, which is essentially based on your first threshold. And with all the limitations that we know of thresholds, obviously, but again, calibrating that properly. And then on the flip side, what I've seen is that, again, going back to a point I made previously in the conversation, the sheer lack of general physical preparedness of the athletes in general, especially in CrossFit, with the few fighters that I've had as well. Obviously, endurance sports, that's kind of their bread and butter, so they spend a lot of time there. But for other athletes that evolve in more intermittent sports, they just have, from a metabolic standpoint, they're not doing great. They're not very healthy, quote unquote, right? Elias said that VO2 max kind of expresses your capacity. And if you look at submaximal anchor points, so thresholds, threshold 1, threshold 2, you'll see kind of their metabolic fitness, if we may use that term. And a lot of people are lacking that tremendously. And so when you understand the implications, even from a health standpoint, that, okay, the athletes have to train hard. CrossFit is a tough sport. You have to put in the hours. The intensity is part of the game. But whatever we can do to mitigate against the intensity and the stress on the nervous system that is applied through that training, whatever we can do, we should, especially if it's going to have a positive impact on their performance and on their health. And that's what I see in zone 2. It's a minimal amount of work, especially for those who've never done it. You don't need to, it's one of those things, you have to get in where you are. So obviously when you read Niels van der Poel's training manual, and he was doing 35 hours of zone 2 a week at 260 watts, which is not even zone 2 for him, that's zone 1, but we can talk about it later. He's doing 35 hours per week because he's been training for 15 years and because he can tolerate that amount of volume, and he needs that amount of volume to get the adaptations to continue adapting, because we talked about it, diminishing returns, right? That's just one of the fundamental principles of physical preparation. And so if you have 0 hours of zone 2 of low intensity work in your week currently, 1 or 1.5 hours is going to be enough to move the needle. It's going to take 8 to 12 weeks to start feeling and seeing differences, but you are going to see them. And I've seen it time and time again with very, very minimal volumes. And obviously then you have to be smart about, okay, how can we increase that volume? Can we increase that volume? At what time of the year should we increase that volume relative to competition, relative to the sport, relative to the needs? But it's a very, very easy starting point. Once you talked about buy-in before, once you have buy-in from the athlete or from the coach, it's the easiest thing to implement into your training that is going to, in my estimation, have the biggest impact on your training in general. And the few things that I've seen with people that have actually done the work is simple stuff, that fall even outside of training: better sleep, better recovery. And when they say recovery, it's like, okay, from one session to the next, I recover better. From one set to the next, I recover. I get to Friday, and before I was fried, and now I can actually push on Friday and still do a good Saturday training and take my day off on Sunday because I can tolerate the volume better, right? And that's it. And that's how I see zone 2. It's the general adaptations that are going to have the biggest impact on your sport specific training, which then those are going to have the biggest impact on your performance and competition, right? So I think trying to find the direct link between zone 2 and your specific sport or competition event is not the right way to go. You should see zone 2 as, we talk about base training, right? It is the base of your pyramid, and what you superimpose onto the base is going to be the specific work, and then you're going to competition. And if you look at it in that framework, you start to see athletes that can do more work, can tolerate more work, can perform better when they're doing intensity, because now they actually have coins left in the bank to do real intensity. Because when you're doing zone 2, but it's not actually zone 2, it's zone 3, sometimes zone 4, you're paying every time. You have to pay, right? It's essentially the way that I see it. And it's let's use it as a simplified model, so it's wrong, but it's useful here. Once you pass your first threshold, it's going to cost you. It's going to cost you from a metabolic standpoint, from a nervous standpoint, from a tissue standpoint. And so everything that you do above that threshold, you have to pay for. And so if you've already paid a bunch because your low intensity wasn't actually low enough, you don't have as much to spend on your high intensity stuff. But now if you really pull that back, really train at low intensity when you have to, then when it's time to go hard, you can actually throw down real hard and do some real damage in a positive way, and have a stimuli that's actually going to be much more potent, and that's going to be able to elicit some very, very interesting adaptations.
That was a really good stream. I think, like what you talked about with CrossFit, I see the same thing with strength athletes. Like, regardless, I think there's 2 zone 2s. Like, I consider there's, the weight room zone 2 for strength athletes. I think this is the stuff that you see in, I consider 80% that, 80% 1RM, where that kind of, specialty training kind of lies in, where they do a lot of volume. I see that as kind of zone 3. I kind of look at strength sport as a pyramidal model. And some of that base stuff is general conditioning, whether that's, carrying heavy loads for long periods of times, whether that's, doing, 50 reps with the, incline press or flat bench dumbbells, like getting blood flow to the tissue, hypertrophy, getting more blood flow for enhanced recovery in the future, right? Angiogenesis, all this stuff. I think there, and then there's just, the level of zone 2 of, if you are fitter, you are going to recover quicker. If you can recover quicker, you can strength train more. And there's always that fear with CrossFitters and strength athletes, whether it's Olympic lifting or powerlifting. It's like, I've lifted some of my heaviest weights, running the highest endurance loads in my life. And that's after years of not lifting. So, it's N of 1, but I'm just saying people are much more fearful of this interference effect. And it's real. That's right.
That's such an interesting conversation, the interference, and I'll come back to it. But I've had feedback from people now that I chat regularly with. This guy Clément, who's a powerlifter in France. I think he's top of the food chain in the 94 kilo category, and he messaged me like a couple weeks ago on Instagram, and he said, I've been including those very low intensity nose breathing 30 minutes per week rowing sessions, and I recover better. I can train more. I feel good. He's a top level power lifter, and he takes just 30 minutes out of his week to do a little bit of low intensity. I mean, I talked about all the metabolic stuff, but from a nervous standpoint too, it's like, it's, I don't like the word reset, but it's a way to rebalance your autonomic nervous system, because if we're all go all the time, we're purely sympathetic, and I think the field in general is trending towards that, thanks to people like Pat Davidson and others. But it's not about one side or the other. It's about variability. It's about being able to access both ends of the spectrum, whatever spectrum we're talking about. But you have to have a balance and being able to, get into a position, get out of a position, get into an autonomic state, get out of an autonomic state. And if we can't get out of sympathetic, because that's just how we operate all the time, that is going to have some impact on our nervous system, on our recovery potential. And so that's another side that I see as beneficial regarding this type of work, especially with athletes that have to be very sympathetic because of their sports. Actually having that other side of the spectrum brings a lot to the table to maybe find a better balance, if we can talk like that. And you were talking about interference before. Sorry. That's a question that I used to get more when I was more involved in rugby, physical prep. And I guess a very common question for in the French speaking community, coaches community around here is like, but there's interferences between such a work and another type of work. So how do we do it? How do we organize our week? I'm like, dude, you work with an amateur team. You have 2 trainings per week. You have a game on the weekend. You have no time at all to train your guys. Are you really going to try and pick the best theoretical framework that you can, or are you just going to do with the cards that you were dealt? So at some point we have to stop thinking in abstract notions and think practically. How much time do I have? What do I need to train? And then just do the best with what you can. Obviously, there's going to be interferences, but when I had an hour and a half per week to prep my guys for a rugby season, you don't get to pick, am I doing this day or this that day? No, we're going to do everything. We're just going to try and be smart about how we organize it and sequence it within a given session, so that obviously we're going to do the speed first and then build into maybe some endurance work, finish with some contact prep. Maybe later in the preseason, we might do the contact prep first, the kind of wrestling type of grappling type of stuff. Maybe we'll do that first, because that is obviously a very intense stimuli on the nervous system in the body, because someone's trying to take you down. And then you organize your speed around that, or maybe you just do retention cycle on speed, and then you keep building the endurance. So we don't have a choice. We have to build all those qualities, and we just have to think about what's our context and how can we optimize for it.
Yeah, this is a great stream that will move right into like general specific, right? Because this kind of blends really well in that area where people, like we're talking about interference effect, everything must be surrounded in context. If you're for example, I'd like to hear how you think of this, but in my perspective, I have these kind of training thresholds, right? If you're, let's say you're an endurance athlete and you're under, let's just say a cyclist, and you're under 10 hours a week, there's certain things that are going to be kind of irrelevant for you to be chasing, right? You're under this threshold of, everyone's going to be different. Everyone's not going to be 10 hours, give or take, right? But, there's certain things that you need to be less worried about and certain things that you need to be more worried about. And how you train in the gym when you're, only training 10 hours less is going to be different than when you're training 20 hours plus, right? And you're a pro cyclist. Are you chasing very specific demands in the gym? I think depends a lot on just one, your training age, and two, the cyclical or varied nature of your sport, right? Is your sport very cyclical, like running and cycling? You're going to need some sport specific, but maybe a little bit less, right? Because you're doing so much of this cyclical stuff, you need to kind of balance out a little bit. Whereas if you're doing something like maybe rugby or CrossFit, you do need some of this assistance work, but you can maybe find some more specific, things relative to the movers. I don't know. How do you think of that? How do you think of it similar?
Trying to look, similar to you, trying to look at the overall profile of an athlete that I have in front of me. And my thought goes to, where are the biggest gaps that we can easily fill to bring him up? Rising tide raises all boats kind of idea. So, and that was maybe the aha moment I had was after I chatted with Alex Hutchinson, who wrote the great book Endure. And he was talking about the different schools of thought and different training methods that he went through his career. He traveled a lot. He experienced the American system, the Canadian system. I believe he was in the UK, even in Australia. And every time it was like, every time I was doing like finding this new method and boom, I was getting better. Right. And what the aha moment for me was that one sentence, and I'm definitely not quoting directly, I'll probably botch it, but it's like the best stimuli is the one you've never had, or the one that you haven't had in a long time. And so if an athlete comes to me and said, oh, I've been doing a lot of this kind of work recently, but I've left that aside for a good reason or not, doesn't matter. Probably the best thing we can do right now is revisit something you haven't done in a long time, or do something that you've never done before. Regardless of whether it's specific to what you need or not, it's a gap that we need to fill. If we look at general preparation, the goal is not transfer to the specific movement, the specific biomechanics, biodynamics of the sport. The goal is to establish the widest foundation possible to support your sport specific training. And so I actually like going the farthest away possible from the sport to start with, and then see what has not been done there. What has not been addressed? Oh, you're an MMA fighter. You train 12 hours a week, but you've never done low intensity on a bike, and you've never actually done a few hard sessions on the bike, like structured sessions. Well, you can probably get a lot of positive adaptations that are going to transfer to your training from some very simple stuff that looks nothing like your sport. Yeah, but boxing is all upper body, and every MMA and boxer can tell you that. No, it is not about the upper body. It all starts from the ground. And if you can't hold on your legs in your 10th round, well, guess what? It doesn't matter how hard you can punch. And so all those things, really actually getting away from the sport to try and better fill the gaps, to then move into the more specific down the line, but not being in a hurry to try and address those specific needs, because there's so many gaps on the general side that need to be filled.
Yeah. You couldn't have said it better. That was a really nice, and just kind of brought some things into my head that I haven't really looked at it in that way. Is that, it is more of a gap filling. Like I've, tested lots of different athletes in different capacities, and the weight room was one of the probably where I have the most data in my head from working with people all over different sports of different kinds. And some of the stuff that I would see people jump to, like people doing plyometrics, but they can't do 5 single leg calf raises. That was a very common one, especially with fighters. I've seen it from fighters all over the place. Or people, going in and doing these crazy conditioning rounds on the heavy bag and, which is very different, but they can't skip for 15 minutes. You know what I mean? If you can't skip for 15 minutes, but you expect to be able to, competently do, footwork for 15 minutes or 25 minutes, and just the weakness in the feet, like, and the wrists, for example. One thing with fighting, and I'll give you a little something that I spent a long time. It took me a long time to figure out this. The 2 weakest points in a fighter's body are generally their feet and their ankles and their wrists. And where does every bit of your power start from and end from? Those 2 points. So, just kind of taking a step back and addressing the general structure first. And, like you said, what is the needs? And I think you probably see the same thing, is that the needs are generally fairly similar throughout all these sports, because there's a lot of dogma carrying the training cycles and the training periodization, whatever it is for the sports, that kind of leave all these inherent important qualities outside of it. I don't know if that's something that you kind of notice, but
that's definitely how I see it. And I guess it's an advantage on that side to not have a dog in the fight in any given sport. I've practiced different sports through the years. I've done soccer when I was younger, rugby, some CrossFit, weightlifting, rowing, indoor rowing, and touched on a few other ones. But again, I'm not married to a sport. I'm not married to a method. So like you said, really coming from the outside and looking at the general aspect of this athlete. What's his profile through and through, start to finish? Where are there gaps? And if you can fill those gaps, that's maybe the best place you can start, because there are gaps. So you're going to get good adaptations off the bat because the best stimuli is the one you've never had. And then you get buy-in. And then maybe you can start having smarter conversations about what needs to be addressed down the line. Maybe there's some topics that are untouchable right now with a given athlete or a given coach, and you need that buy-in and you need a little bit of legwork before you can get to them. And so that starting point is just the barrier to entry, and it's pretty low because, you know, again, if somebody's never done, and regardless, I truly believe now, regardless of their sport, if they've never done an hour per week of true low intensity work, sitting on a bike, watching Netflix, that's the low hanging fruit that needs to be picked. And then we can move on to more advanced things. And obviously it's not cool. It's not fun training. It's nothing to brag about when you're riding at 100 watts on your bike for an hour, and you don't want to post that picture, right? It's like, well, who cares? They're going to laugh at me because I'm doing so little work. Well, guess what? That's probably the most important one. And I also think about those general qualities, and especially that low intensity work, we're coming back to it. It is the one that you can keep improving throughout a career over decades, truly decades. You talk to pro cyclists and they'll tell you, my VO2 max isn't moving much. My threshold isn't moving much, but my durability, that I can still make adaptations. I can still move the needle on that and make a true difference on how do I sprint after 5 hours of going up and down mountains? Well, that I can still improve. How much watts I can produce in 10 seconds? It's probably going to start creeping down with the years, and you're probably not going to get much out of that type of training. Plus it's super stressful. So as you age, get diminishing returns. But again, they're the easiest adaptations to get. They're the ones that have the most long-lasting impact on both performance and health, and you can keep improving them over a lifetime. So why wouldn't you do it? It's like CrossFitters that are not doing any bodybuilding work or some general hypertrophy work. It's like put 1 or 2 sessions into your week, and you'll see that within a month or two, your joints stop hurting, right? Ben, what's his name? The British bobsleigh athlete, what's his name? Ben the Bounce on Instagram, who's got some crazy fucking hops. I forget his last name, sorry. Anyway, that's what he was saying too. He's like, if I don't have a physio with me all the time, I do bodybuilding work because this is my maintenance work. This is how my tissues feel better. This is how I bring blood flow to everything, and my joints stop hurting. So I meet you there. For me, hypertrophy work, or basic bodybuilding type work, is the equivalent in the weight room for what zone 2 is on the conditioning side. And if you're not doing some amount of both of those trainings, again, depending on your sport, you might not need as much of one or the other. But if you're not doing some those type of if you're not trying to drive those type of adaptations from one side or the other, I think there's some easy things to be done here that could have a very positive impact on what you're doing.
Yeah, no, I 100% I agree there. The something I'd like to hear about, because I'm always interested in, as a practitioner, you know, a lot of the stuff that you bring out there is generally through an experimentation with yourself. So be interested in hearing, you know, being so busy managing all the things that you do, what does your training look like? Is it a lot of it just experimentation? Is a lot of it kind of structured around specific goals that you had? Because I know I seen you doing some sprint work on the bike erg, which was cool, especially in the chamber, the hypoxia. That stuff was super interesting to see you out there.
That hurt.
I don't doubt. Yeah. So like, what is your training like?
My training is mostly based around low intensity training right now. I'm trying to get 4 to 6 days on the bike. I have a bike rig at home, so it's easy. And the vast majority of those sessions are under my first threshold. Last time I measured it, and I'm due for a retest pretty soon. I was around 170 watts. So most of my work is 140 watts, sometimes 150, and once a week, maybe 160. But most of it is 140 watts. Don't usually have a ton of time in any given day, so it's usually an hour. And I know I need to start extending that, because this is where you see a lot of further adaptations and benefits in terms of fat oxidation and economy and fatigue resistance. So that is coming down the line. I still have the goal that I still have is to row a 615 2K on the Concept 2. I did 621 and some in competition a while back when I was training a lot. Right now, I'm really focused on building my business and expanding this. So I'm really not focused on my performance. It's in the back of my mind every single day. Yeah. But I know that if I try to do everything at the same time, I'm just going to crash. Yeah. So I'm trying to be very, very patient. And I know that the Zone 2 stuff is going to support my everyday work because it's general. And so it is going to help me tolerate more workload, even from a mental standpoint, and then just be healthier in general and give me the base that I'm going to need once I start rowing again to go and chase those numbers. So right now it's mostly this once a week, once every 2 weeks, maybe I'll throw in a high intensity session. And so at some point in time, like you mentioned, I did a block of sprint interval training earlier in this year to try and see what kind of adaptations we could see, what could we measure with the Moxie. But right now I have a lot of things to do. And so I don't have the bandwidth to actually train properly, but it's not a goal. It's what's going to happen. That's the plan, is that in a couple years, that's how I foresee it. In a couple years, I will be able to take 2 to 3 hours a day to train properly. And at that time, I will be able to just sit down with everything that I've learned and be like, okay, Sean, let's take that from the bottom and build it up and see how we can get to that, and actually test the model that I'm kind of building through all those testing sessions and all the learning that I'm doing. So that's something that I really, really look forward to and I think about a lot, but I just cannot afford right now to commit to it because I know it's not sustainable with everything else that I'm doing. So once I can actually distance myself a little bit from the day to day and have more hours for myself, I will be giving it another shot, let's say, because I really want to go get that arbitrary number that I fixed for myself, but it's really something that I want. So I'm going to go get it. But right now it's purely maintenance work, a little bit of hypertrophy work a few times a week, a little bit of strength work in conjunction with that Zone 2. But it's really heavily Zone 2 driven, let's say.
There's a lot of wisdom in what you just said there. Like I think if because there's a lot of this all or nothing mentality, right, when it comes to staying in shape for people, especially busy people. And also hearing one thing I don't hear that often is like, you get this trainer road type group, higher intensity, because we're more busy, stressful lives, and we got to fit it in and we're going to get more adaptation. I don't necessarily agree with that. And it's not that I'm like stuck to saying that can't work for some people. I just think if people were to actually measure their recovery and measure their autonomic arousal and the state that they're in for majority of the days waking up or throughout their sleep, they would probably look at those high intensity sessions a little bit differently. I think the way you're talking about it makes a lot of sense to me, and a lot of people don't have that type of not only wisdom but egoless. They have a little bit of ego to regard, right? I can't get on a trainer for 4 or 5 days a week and only push 140 to 170 watts, right? Like that's very hard to do. It takes a lot of self-control for a lot of people.
I did learn about it the hard way. Yeah. In the sense that when I was training on the indoor rower a few years back, I didn't know what I know today. I don't think I ever did a Zone 2 session. Never. Really? Like a year and a half where I trained 4 to 5 days on the rower per week, plus a couple of days of pretty significant strength work on the side, plus sometimes another bike session. I never did a Zone 2 session, and I paid the price for it. And it was also at a crossroads when we moved back here, and I was transitioning back to working full time in the convenience store. at the loading dock, simply because I had to kind of restart my coaching business here. Once we had moved, I didn't have enough clients to support us. So I had that job, and I was working on the loading dock from 6 a.m. to 3 p.m. And then I was coaching clients, and then I was coaching rugby every night. And I went from getting back here, still training a lot on the rower. And I was on this stint of, okay, I want to break all my records on every distance and metric that exists on the Concept 2 rower. So, and I still have, I can actually pull it up for those watching the video. I still have the notes, the app notes, where I had all my records on the erg, and then what I wanted to try and get. And twice a week, I would go and look for a personal best, right? Twice a week. So that was the note. And I have all my numbers here of what they were and what I was trying to achieve. And so, yeah, twice a week, I was doing an all out max effort on any given distance. And unsurprisingly, I got hurt, right? Unsurprisingly, once I transitioned to just training to working full time, plus rugby, plus this, plus the stress of the new life, I hurt my back. And I dragged that along the way for 18 months, and being afraid every day of, okay, is my back going to go again? Am I going to be able to work today? Like that was really, really shitty. And so I think you can obviously get those adaptations. And I wrote that 621 based essentially on that high intensity training. But looking back, had I had a bit more base, had I had a bit more, fatigue resistance, capacity, tolerance to volume and intensity, I would probably have fared better. Maybe it wouldn't have prevented the injury, because it was a very tough period for me, and this is how it happened. So, I had to live through that, and now come back on the other side and be like, this is why it all went down this is why it all went down the wrong way. So I know the alternative, and I know that I've done it before, and I know that it's maybe productive for a certain amount of time, but it is definitely not sustainable. And right now I need sustainable, because I need to build what I'm building in the way that I want it to be built, to then afford me the time to go and train properly.
No, that's a very good lesson everyone has to learn that. There's unless you have the utmost guidance from people that are very, very effective at planting the seed of, how things are supposed to be done. Most of us outside of that are going to learn the hard way. We're going to have to learn the hard way. And the harder the lesson, the deeper that lesson sinks, right? And the more that you can portray that to other athletes, right? Because it's so fresh and it's so tender. It's much easier to effectively communicate that with others, that you integrate it, and you can also see it more clearly because of that bias of going through that. Now it's like the Texas shooter fallacy. Everything you point, you're going to see it. Oh, you draw the circle around it. That was, regardless if it's, we know that's just a problem. We know that's a problem out there. So, and a lot of people have it. So it's cool that, you've come out the other side of that. And gain some very useful insight. Let's move into to final questions, because some of them you might have a little bit of longer answers on. So I want to give you some time. So the first one is essentially, there's plenty of research diagnostics out there, medical diagnostics, whether it's MRI, MRS, like magnetic resonance spectroscopy, NIRS, even like an Oxymon, like the clinical grade NIRS devices, $50,000 metabolic carts. If you could have anything out there to collect your data set and compact it like a VO2 master, take it out anywhere with an athlete like a Moxie, what would that be? I know that, it's out there, but I'm interested to hear what you are interested in exploring and why.
That's a great question. I think a constant lactate monitor would be really interesting to look at. Again, with all the limitations of lactate as we know them, I think having there's a strength and a weakness to having one data point every 5 minutes or however often you take your measurement. Obviously, the strength is that you have one pretty curve, and then you just do what you have to do. And then you have the limitation that it's one data point every 5 minutes, whereas the Moxie you can get 2 per second, or even if it's one every 2 seconds, it's still a lot of data that you collect, which adds a lot of complexity to the interpretation process, but maybe reveals some really interesting dynamics inside the body that we're maybe not aware of yet, or that maybe can inform us on different things that are happening. So I think that would be really interesting for me to look at. From a near standpoint, I'm very, very interested in what's going on in the non-involved muscles, especially during severe intensity exercise. So in well-trained athletes, anytime they go above their threshold, what I've seen is a significant desaturation of the non-involved muscles. So obviously there's the whole redirection of blood flow towards local motor muscles and maybe respiratory muscles in the case of the respiratory metabolic reflex hypothesis. There's also, in the back of my mind, I can't shake that, maybe lactate oxidation in the periphery because you're producing so much or accumulating so much in the blood that your body has to shuttle it to somewhere, and it can do that, and it does do that. And then this is why you see oxygen levels drop in that vicinity. So I think just better understanding those oxygen kinetics on the whole body level, which is again very complex because there's so many muscle groups and different fiber types and different distributions and profiles amongst athletes, and even those profiles can change over to some extent over through training over a career. So yeah, constant lactate monitor, and then better understanding what's going on at a systemic level in severe intensity exercise. Those are very interesting to me. For the other tools that you mentioned, I currently wouldn't know what to do with them. Oh, sorry, no, the biggest one, right now it's out of my budget, but something like a PhysioFlow to look at cardiac output. So that I guess it would give us the other part that we don't see often enough. We have with the VO2 Master, we have the oxygen consumption, obviously, but we also have VT, so tidal volume, and we have respiratory frequency. And with the heart, we only have the heart rate. We only ever have heart rate. But there's the other half to that component, which is the volume that is pumped at every beat. And what are the kinetics of that over a given intensity distribution? And there's some literature on it, but it goes in every direction depending on what population you're looking at. Do you reach a plateau in ejection volume at a certain level? Do you keep going up depending on what your training status is? Can you truly change that through training interventions over time? So that is a parameter I think that would be very, very interesting to add to the other ones. And then I can talk about it now because they have an Instagram page. So the new tool that Evan's been working on with his company and looking at nitric oxide and maybe other metrics at a local level, at a peripheral level, and how those might complement our interpretation of the overall profile with the other metrics that we already have. I think those are the most interesting to me at this point in time.
Yeah, I've consulted with the PhysioFlow guys, and it's just, I'm stuck with, I got an EKG, and I'm still trying to pull out as much as I can from EKGs. There's limitations, right? You mostly have to do it on males. It's pretty invasive for female, right? So it's on males, and there's a lot to try and pull out just resting EKGs. Like, what are we seeing with the electrophysiology? What are we seeing with the cardiac morphology of the tissues? Are we seeing left ventricle, right ventricle? Are we seeing some atrial hypertrophy there as well? T-wave inversions, all these different things you can pull out just from adaptations of the athlete, just from EKG. Then another step would be like ultrasound, super interested in that. But you're right, dude. Like the PhysioFlow, I think, has a lot of answers. I mean, I think when you can, because for myself, the only way for me to get anything close to stroke volume is with the metabolic cart, and that's VO2 divided by heart rate. And that doesn't really give us a sound measurement. It's a good proxy, to understand where it's plateauing and if it's decreasing at the end of a step test. But yeah, you're right. The PhysioFlow continuous lactate, that's actually something that Paul Larson was talking about too when I asked him that question. I think
Okay.
it will be, you're right. I think we'll gain a lot from that continuous, right? Like all those things are super interesting. Like all those things, I think, and a lot of them are obtainable, right? So that's the cool thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the nearest thing, you're right. Like I just seen that the other day in a runner, going down to almost 0 in the forearm, right? And the brachioradialis, I'm like, this is insane. I see that with other elite runners too. Yeah,
And
those are.
yeah, sorry, something that just to bounce back on that non-evolved muscle Moxie curve or data trend. I've seen, because I had it on the bicep when I did my 3 and my 12-minute efforts on the bike for my when I was calculating my critical power, and it actually behaves like a W prime, right? So it goes down slowly or more. The slope is less aggressive on the 12-minute effort, and those 3 and 12 minutes, I'd done them already 3 times by that time, so I knew what I could do, and I was really on the limit of what I could achieve. So they were kind of true max efforts, if I might say so. And the slope on the 12-minute was very gradual or more gradual, and it reached the SMO2 minimum at the point where I finished the 12 minutes. And the 3-minute test was a lot steeper, and also met the SMO2 minimum when I finished my 3-minute effort. And so again, the blending of the underlying physiology and the critical power model and that W prime and the work of Brett Kirby that he did and Andre and others. Now a lot more information is coming out on that. So again, if we can marry what's going on under the hood and what the actually output on the power meter or on the track is, that becomes really, really interesting. So that's another aspect that I need to just understand better, I guess.
Yeah, more hours in the day to, you know what I mean? Just more hours. Get them, find them.
If only.
So another one, if you only had a single test, right? So not a combination of tests, just a single protocol and a single test to do with an athlete for 5 years. You might be already good with it. It might be just something you want to understand better. What would that test be, and what would the diagnostic tool be?
Can I only pick one tool?
Yeah, just one tool.
Ooh, that is. So I've settled on that protocol that I use now with the vast majority of the athletes that I test, which is a longer step test, which are 4-minute work stages with 1-minute rest intervals all the way up. And again, I try to collect 9 to 12 intervals in total. So if I calibrate it properly, and they reach volitional failure, let's say on the last interval, ideally they finish it. So that's kind of the framework that I've settled on. And I think it's a good compromise between all the protocols that currently exist when we talk about different physiological tests to assess different metrics. So that's kind of the middle ground that I've reached. So I would probably stick with that. But then what one metric I would use? Maybe heart rate.
Really?
Maybe just plain heart rates, in the sense that, well, no, because I can't get thresholds out of that. Maybe lactate. It's hard to pick one, and see that's probably it's a hard question, because that is the reason why I try to use all those different tools and all those different metrics. It's because they all tell you something that's complementary to the overall picture. I don't want to have to choose one. Yeah. So I'm resisting your question a little bit, but maybe lactate, maybe heart rate. I guess the simplest one would be heart rate. And that's actually, I get athletes to replicate the exact same step test by themselves, just with their heart rate monitor, a few weeks after we did the initial profiling and after they've run their training. Because again, you can pick up a lot of adaptations already just on that given test, right? You write them at the same intensities, same work to rest ratios, same starting point. They'll usually push a couple steps farther, and you'll see some significant heart rate differences where they actually did the training, or sometimes everywhere if the training was very fruitful for them. So Yeah, it's a very hard question to answer. I don't know if I have one magic tool. I don't want, let's, I'll be honest here. I don't want to pick one tool.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear you.
I don't want to have to pick
I
one
hear ya.
tool, and nobody should, in my
Yeah.
opinion.
Yeah. No, I hear you. Yeah. It's just a thought experiment for me. And I think too, because it's good to hear the thought process of why someone would, the answers that they have, right? Like, because some people are very happy picking one tool because that's their comfort zone, right? And some people too, it's good for the folks out there sometimes to hear, because they're like, I don't want to get, maybe heart rate and maybe I just want lactate, maybe I just want heart rate, you know what I mean? But it is, I do agree with you. Like, it's very hard for me to just pick one tool and be like, hey, let's make any decisions off this. I have a hard time making decisions off of one tool. It's hard.
And another train of thought would be, well, I'll pick the VO2 master because we could probably extract some ventilatory thresholds, and we'll be able to do it even better once they introduce the CO2 sensor, and we can look at how the athlete is breathing. Yeah. And that, in my opinion, is another area we didn't talk about today, but that is ripe for the picking as well. I mean, a diaphragm is a muscle, intercostals are muscles, respiratory muscles are muscles. We can train them like muscles. And if they've never been trained specifically before, we are going to be able to extract some amount of adaptations from them. And even if it's not a direct transfer to performance, increasing the awareness of an athlete around how they breathe and what the impact of that breathing is going to have on their performance, that alone is worth the time that it's going to take to introduce some amount of respiratory training. So, another me would say, well, I'll pick the VO2 master because I can get a lot of that data, and then I can really assess how that athlete is developing on that side of things over many years. So yeah, again, going back maybe as a multiple choice answer, I'd pick the lactate if I wanted to see metabolic fitness, if I worked with more endurance athletes in general, because I'd like to see the shape of their curve and the absolute numbers as well. I'd pick the heart rate if I just wanted to see overall response to training and adaptations. I'd pick the VO2 master if I wanted to see thresholds and how they breathe. I'd pick the Moxie if I wanted to see different muscle groups in different situations, or coordination of different muscle groups in a given activity and how all of those interact. It's hard to pick one.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I hear you on that. That's actually something. Stick around after the conversation, just 2 minutes or something I want to ask you on respiratory stuff, just for 2 minutes. Okay, so let's just see here. We'll ask you this one because I'm interested to hear your take on this. If what it is, if you're okay with sharing something that if you met a large failure in your training intervention, maybe with yourself or with a client, doesn't have to be training intervention. It could just be a lesson learned of methodology, ego, whatever it is, or a preconceived notion that you had, an incorrect hypothesis that you learned a great deal from. Right? Like, this is something that it still kind of sticks into your understanding today and still kind of informs your decision making, maybe not. But and what was the thinking and bias that preceded that? Like, what was it that drew you down that rabbit hole and got you caught? And what made you realize that you were kind of off course? What gave you the epiphany that, maybe I wasn't? I
think it's probably when I was trying to interpret the world out of one Moxie monitor. And that was my starting point with exercise physiology and testing in general. But then that was maybe pretty ripe in the Moxie community a few years back still, and I'd say less now, where people have contextualized the tool a little bit better. But I still think there are some overreaches in terms of what conclusion people might draw from a single local measurement that they take on a given athlete at a given point in time. So that was probably my biggest failure at the start. And the way that I've evolved is try to collect as many tools that I can to try and get as many relevant metrics as possible to get the most complete picture of the athlete that I can. So that and I guess I didn't have the budget to buy everything off the bat. And because again, I was interested in the Moxie through Evan's work. So that was kind of the gateway for me, which is probably the opposite of most people that might start with lactate or VO2 and then build to other tools. So I kind of went backwards in the field, if I can say that. So that was probably, that was probably it. It was trying to interpret too much out of one data point and not being clear enough on the limitations of that measurement tool. That I think that's the biggest thing. And and that's something that I've maybe a drum that I've been beating quite a bit recently is maybe more important than, or as important as understanding your tool well and how to use it is understand its limitations through and through. If you can tell me exactly when your tool is good and when your tool is bad, and especially when your tool is maybe the wrong tool, or why you cannot trust your measurement in a given condition for whatever reason you might find, if you can explain that really well, I think that you've understood it and that you kind of earned the right to use it and in a good way. I think that's probably the biggest mistake we can do is be blind to the limitations of the tool that we use and not be conscious of its limitations. That's probably it. And I'd probably go, and I haven't thought about that enough to be sure. So I'll give that a 70% kind of confidence from my standpoint. But it might be the most important thing in exercise physiology, as I understand it right now, is understanding the limitations of any given tool that you use so that you can better apply it.
Yeah, that was a really good one. I think that's one of the better ones I've heard so far. For sure, maybe the best. That was great, Sean. This is a great conversation. Very happy to have you on the podcast. You Thanks, have man. several places people can find you. I was honestly considering learning French again, just so I could get more of your content on YouTube, because you have gold on YouTube. I learned French when I was a kid to some degree, but I just was so opposed to it because all my friends started speaking. Anyways, and I was like, dude, there's so much content on here I just actually want to hear your thoughts on that I'm considering learning French again. So that I wouldn't say that for many people, right? Learning a language just to get more content.
Thanks, man.
Sean has
it.
No problem. You deserve it. He's got a great YouTube channel where he does post in French and English. And he posts all his podcasts up there, Upside Strength, right, on YouTube.
That's it.
And he has a podcast as well, the Upside Strength podcast. He, Collie Moore's is probably my favorite physiology podcast, where, deep into the weeds, hemoglobin, all these different things, going deep into it. But you have the best podcast by far in the breadth, because you don't have any, bias towards one system or trying to pull out, it's all polarized, or you don't have an agenda. Not that Coley does. I was just saying, like, your podcast, you bring on people from CrossFit, you bring on people from, every corner of the sport world. So, it's like a home base. It's always, the first podcast I go to when it updates. It's great podcast. And you're on Upside Strength on Instagram as well.
Yeah. Upside underscore strength, because I lost my previous Upside Strength account to fishing. So
the joys of
that happened.
The joys of the internet and security. So I'll leave all that stuff in the show notes, so people can find it. But yeah, this has been a great discussion. So hope you enjoy, folks.